It's a pleasure to be here. And it's a pleasure to be here with Wolfgang because, as you'll see momentarily, we share a love of data and thinking about how to use data to understand the economy a lot more deeply. So Wolfgang will go ahead and start by setting the stage in terms of where the global economy, the global consumer is going to go over the next decade, some of the big shifts, the big trends in terms of the shopping basket. And then we'll delve into a little bit more of some micro themes, leveraging some of the unique data that we have here at Mastercard. So Wolfgang, over to you.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Thank you, Shamina. Thank you, Michael. This is the coolest happening event, I think, not just of the week, but of the year. And I know so many in this room and so many online are excited. So an honor to be here. And I want to talk especially about the middle class for two reasons. One is no business can succeed without the middle class. 60% of spending in the world that was mentioned is by the middle class. And second, the middle class is the most misunderstood and under-focused, and we just heard about focus, mega trend in the world. And as you can see here on the slide, there's a lot of confusion out there in the middle class. And I have a lot of reputable journals. Some say it's declining, others say it's stagnant, others it's increasing. It's quite confusing. It's misunderstood, we think. If you look at the data carefully, and for a change now we go back in history, there's only one conclusion, which is the middle class train is actually unstoppable. And some have been trying and might still try to stop or derail the train, but it's very tough because here are the numbers. The first billion in the middle class was a long time ago. That was just when I was born, way before Michelle was born. And the second billion then took a while, 2006. You were all there, you remember? Some of our kids were born then, Gen Z time, second billion. So what happened since then? It's like clockwork, surprising. A lot of headlines in the world, a lot of, some say craziness. Clockwork, every 9 years, a billion. Third billion, 2015. Fourth billion just last year, here during the summit, we announced it. Fifth billion, we project another 9 years, 2033. And then it'll slow down because of more demographic than economic reasons. So that's a force that should be part of your understanding and your reflections. And these times were turbulent times. And I'm not talking about 2025 here. Financial crisis, middle class grew because of East Asia. COVID, it declined, but it recovered quickly because of South Asia. And now we are in a world where the middle class is going broadly still strong, and middle class life is actually quite different, and that's why it matters to understand the middle class. Poor people have no choices. Poor people spend their money on food, on shelter, on clothing. Middle class consumers have choices, and they actually start to become your consumers and also use credit cards, which we project at $25 per person per day in terms of spending threshold. And so this is some work we have been doing, and I know it relates to the work that Michelle and her team has been doing. So I wanted to ask you, Michelle, how those spending categories relate to your work.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that we spend a lot of time on is looking at the why, the how, the where consumers are spending across the globe. And we do it in a way to understand the different economic environments that influence these shopping cart, the decisions that consumers are making. And income is absolutely a critical component. So one of the things that we do is look at zip code level data across the globe, in the US in particular, where our data is really quite robust, and break it down by different income cohorts by zip code. And you do see certainly more discretionary spending, more discretionary services spending in the higher income cohorts than in the lower income cohorts, where essentials is a lot larger of a share of the basket. The other important consideration is the volatility of spending as well. During times of economic stress, higher income economies, higher income consumers have the ability to smooth through their spending a lot more. You don't see the same fluctuations. But for lower income communities, lower income families, you do see a lot more volatility in the environment where income freezes or if there's a paycheck challenge. You'll see that adjustment a lot more quickly as well. So the evolution that you showed before in terms of that time series, it's more and more of the global economy becomes well established, and into that really important middle income class, you should also see presumably fewer fluctuations, a little more stability, which will be important. But one thing we also like to do as economists is give a sense of what's happening in the future, our crystal ball, which admittedly at the moment is probably very cloudy. But let's talk maybe over the next decade in terms of what the middle income class will look like. And I know you have a few slides on that.
Thanks so much, Michelle. And here indeed, here are the numbers. This is again a recollection for you on where we stand today, 8.1 billion people in the world. And we have, for the first time ever, and that's again, maybe surprising to you, middle class majority, absolute majority. 4.1 billion out of 8.1 billion are in the middle class, as we define it, and everybody spending between 12 and 120. So here's the projection for the next 10 years. 2035, and you know the center just celebrated 10 years, so it's that sense also an interesting metric, next 10 years. The poor still in challenge, very stagnation. The biggest change in terms of decline, positive decline, is the vulnerable group, minus 600 million, and the rich grow plus 100 million. So if you add up the numbers together, you'll make a mistake because there's also population growth. So the middle class will actually grow by more than 1 billion. So again, this extra billion that we mentioned before, you see here in the data, 5.2 billion. A pretty unique and new world where almost 2 out of 3 people in the world will live in the middle class. And here is the distribution. Here's the explanation why that growth is happening. Look at the bottom a bit. Europe and America's very little growth, some. America's demographic and economic. Africa, some. The story is about Asia. Asia Pacific, it's still the next decade where middle class life, middle class growth is strongest. So here is my final visual slide, and it's also, I know in this group here, so many countries represented, so many friends you have around the world. You could even do a little exercise and think, when is my country a middle-class country, a middle-class dominated country? And here are the illustrations and the numbers. Many countries in the West and in East Asia, Japan, South Korea had middle-class dominance before 2000. But then you get Brazil and Mexico recently, relatively recently. China became the 100th country with middle-class dominance. And you know this country? Anybody from here, from Western Africa? Cabo Verde is we announced this country of this year, which will reach middle-class status, middle-class dominance. India, Morocco, many countries in between. But then we get to 130, 140 countries, still then a third left that have more vulnerable by 2050, that have that strength of the middle class that is so fundamental to consumer sentiment, but also to democracies, to social stability, to so many other elements of modern life. Michelle, I know that your data, you'll show a lot on the US, but you also have a global view, and you did a lot of work on South Asia, emerging markets, especially India. So yeah, I wanted to have you come in to tell us a bit your insights on that part.
Yeah, of course. The India flag there is particularly interesting. So our economics team in the AP region sitting out of India just conducted a really fascinating study of our data, looking at particularly how the middle income consumer spends. And one observation that stood out to me is in India, the middle income consumer in terms of discretionary means a lot more goods than it is services, particularly apparel, particularly furniture, and really driven by e-commerce. So increasingly, it seems like the trend is moving in that direction. For travel in India, it makes up only about, by our estimates, about 10% of spend. So there's capacity as we continue to see India move along that line to greater and broader income growth. The travel economy there could certainly build some momentum, which will be encouraging to see.
Yeah. So yeah, now you had a bit of the big picture and the global view, and now you will get some exciting insights and data from Michelle on the more granular local and American view.
That sounds great. Okay. So I want to talk through 2 trends that we find really interesting in our data. One is around business formation in the US. Since the pandemic, we've seen pretty extraordinary business formation. There was a low cost of capital, there were fewer barriers of entry, and it was one of the things that made the US economy so dynamic and led to the story of US exceptionalism over the last few years. So when we study our data and we look at the recent business formation, which we can go ahead and pull up the dashboard here, what we're seeing is the business formation is really being led by e-commerce, by online. So here, take, for example, goods. So we can look first at just the 2024 share. The share of new businesses that are being created are overwhelmingly those that have an e-commerce play. So clothing stores, for example, over 50% of new business formation in the US last year was online. And if you look at what that was in 2019, clearly the trend has moved in the direction of more and more e-commerce. The digitalization of the economy has been really important. And it's giving consumers a lot more choices, and it's allowing them to be a lot more nimble, which in this economy, particularly with the threat of tariffs, is going to be really important as consumers try to access products in the best way that they can. And it's not just goods. If you look at services as well, the services economy is also finding its way online. Travel agencies. Don't know the last time you walked into a store for a travel agency, but certainly it's an e-commerce story and increasingly has been. Personal and professional services as well. So when you think about these data sets and what we're seeing in our data in terms of where business creation is coming from, let's bring it back to the conversation we were just having in terms of the global expansion and the need and the desire and the move towards greater middle class exposure. How do you think the digital economy and business creation will contribute to that?
Yeah, thank you, Michelle, for again highlighting these cool insights from your own research. The digital, we all know, is a mega trend, right? So that's not new. But if you combine what you heard just now with what I shared, think of development in two ways. Think of it, people getting richer. That's happening, but it's slowly happening, and it's not linearly happening. But think of it a different way, and here we did some work with a center. Think also of development as accessing services/digital services earlier. So in our estimate, it used to be $10 a day. You had to be actually at the middle class to be a beneficiary of what you see now from Michelle's slide. Now, the number has gone down globally to $5. There's a lot of people between $5 and $10 that could access goods and services now through modern financial means. In some countries, even down to $2. So there is that shift also happening. So think also, when you think, which is the inclusion actually topic, make it easier and cheaper for people to access goods and services. Michelle, there is another mega trend that you will cover, which is sustainability. And I think you have some quite cool insights on the circular economy.
We do. And so cool that we published a blog on it this morning. So if you want to read more about it, it's on our website. But we really wanted to dig into, again, how consumers are spending and why they're spending in the way that they are, and how sustainability plays a role in that. Because it's not just about economics that are going to drive consumer decisions. It's about how shopping makes you feel and what it does, of course, in terms of your priorities. So we looked at online apparel spending in the US, and we identified the resale economy, the merchants that are in the resale space. And we broke that down into luxury price points, super high-end, and the mass market for apparel. And you'll see that for luxury, it's not a new story. The circular economy is a really important part of the apparel space in luxury, making up nearly 30% of online apparel spending has a resale component. But in the mass market, it's still a bit new. It's only making up about 5% or so. The pandemic accelerated the trend because of the need, the lack of inventory, the search for value. And one of the things that we think is going to be really fascinating as we look ahead into the next year, an environment where there's more trade tensions, there's tariffs, there's potentially some disruptions in supply chains. How will the circular economy step in a way of continuing to move products along and continuing to provide consumer choice? So when you look at this chart, how do you think about the trends forward? Again, we're focusing here in the US, but there's a global element there that the circular economy, I think, increasingly matters for.
Yeah. No, when I look at these charts, Michelle, there's also, I always think about also generations, right? Because a lot of talk on younger generations. I'm in the room, and you have kids in that generation, and there's a lot of sense of shifting sentiments. And I think that's true. You see that in the data, but there's also sometimes the say-do gap. In the end, it matters what people spend, not what they just say. But spending does shift also with income and with preference. And this so-called Gen Z generation that we think actually is the richest ever generation, by the way, the largest ever at 2 billion. There's no other generation. And it's richer, not that they have more money than you here in the audience have, but it is that they have more money than you had when you were age 20. And so it will be interesting to watch those two mega trends to confluence and to integrate. And on this one, I just want to pick up, Michelle, on your point on obviously the current big global economic discussions on possibly rising import prices. How much do you think is there space of the circular economy in general beyond closing to compensate for increasing import prices?
Well, I think obviously the tariffs environment, it's moving quickly, and we don't know where it will settle, but it could end up being fairly substantial. Obviously, it's going to be an adjustment in the sense of how quickly some of these resellers can grow, can expand, and become a bigger presence in the market. But the fact that it's happened already in a quite impressive way in the luxury space, it shows that there's capacity to do it more broadly. And that, I think, is going to be the big story in the sense of, will you see in the mass market for online apparel, will you see a lot more of this reselling and circular economy kick in that allows consumers to have more choice? And I think that's a critical part of the story going forward, for consumers to navigate not just the current environment, but to have been able to navigate the last several years where the pandemic has created quite a lot of distortions to the economy. I think that to do so, you need to have choice. You need to have consumers being able to figure out how to find their best value, how to access product, and how to do in a way that's comfortable for them. And this, I think, very much adds to that equation in a favorable way.
Yeah. So well put, Michelle. I hope you enjoyed this warm-up for you for the day. Yeah. So it was a data warm-up. You saw we share the love for data and the love for impact as this event is somehow meant to be. Here are our broad takeaways in this interesting time. First, think about trend lines as much as headlines, but think even more of trend lines because the headlines overtake our daily life. Think of trend lines. Second, especially a company that will grow, don't bet against digital and don't bet against the middle class, and see that there's a few people around who can do cool stuff with data. So with that, enjoy the day, and thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.